The day 3 government sedans parked in front of my house, my neighbor Carol Whitmore finally stopped smiling at me. And honestly, that was the part that unsettled me the most. Because people like Carol always smile, even when they're trying to ruin your life. Especially then. Up until that week, I thought the worst thing that could happen in our neighborhood was getting fined because your trash can stayed out too long after pickup day. Turns out I was very, very wrong. I live in a little subdivision outside Fort Collins, Colorado, the kind of place where everybody waves but nobody really knows each other, where lawns are trimmed like military haircuts, and people somehow treat HOA emails with the same seriousness as jury summons. My house sat near the back entrance on Juniper Hollow Drive, older than most of the others, with faded cedar siding and a front porch that creaked loud enough to announce every Amazon delivery like a gunshot. I loved that house the second I saw it. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. And after my divorce, that mattered more than I can explain. I worked remotely as a network systems engineer for a defense contractor based out of Virginia, which sounded a lot cooler than it actually was. Most days it meant sitting in sweatpants at 2 in the morning staring at monitoring dashboards while drinking coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. But the work paid well, and more importantly, it gave me stability after a couple rough years. The catch was, my internet connection couldn't fail. Ever. Not during deployments, not during maintenance windows, not during overnight audits. So when I moved in, I invested in a serious setup. Fiber line directly routed through the alley utility access, backup power supply in the garage, clean cable management, surge protection, the whole thing. If you weren't looking for it, you'd never notice any of it. Unfortunately, Carol noticed everything. She lived 4 houses down on the corner lot with the perfect hydrangeas and the little decorative lighthouse by her mailbox. Early 60s, maybe, always dressed like she'd just come from a country club luncheon, even when she was dragging garbage bins to the curb. She was president of the HOA, which in our neighborhood basically made her the self-appointed guardian of civilization. Carol had this calm, polished way of talking that somehow made every sentence feel like a warning from HR. She never yelled, never cursed, never lost control. She just tilted her head slightly and say things like, "I'm sure you didn't realize that violates community guidelines," with this sweet little smile that made you feel like a child being corrected by a kindergarten teacher. The first issue started over something stupid. One afternoon, she knocked on my door, holding a folder against her chest like she was serving legal papers. "Afternoon, Ryan," she said. "Just want to check on the antenna installation on your roof." I blinked at her for a second because I genuinely forgot the thing existed. It was a tiny signal relay mounted near the back ridge, barely visible unless you stood in exactly the right spot. "It's not really an installation," I told her. "It's part of my work equipment." She said, looking past me toward the garage. "Well, some residents have concerns about visual clutter." Residents. That word always made me laugh because in HOA language, residents usually meant Carol herself. I explained it wasn't visible from the street, it wasn't causing interference, and technically it fell well within county regulations. She smiled the entire time, nodding slowly like she was pretending to listen to a child explain dinosaurs. "Of course," she said. "We just like to preserve standards around here." That should have been the end of it. But after that, she started appearing everywhere. If a utility truck parked near my house, she'd wander outside pretending to water flowers while watching from across the street. She sent me 2 HOA notices in 1 month, one because my recycling bin was visible from the sidewalk, another because she claimed my garage light was industrial in tone. I wish I were kidding about that. At first I tried laughing it off. My buddy Nate thought the whole thing was hilarious. "Man," he told me one night, over beers, "you got targeted by the final boss of suburban white women." But underneath the jokes, it started wearing on me. There was this constant feeling of being watched, evaluated, quietly pushed. And the weirdest part was, I don't think Carol even saw herself as malicious. I think she genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood from slipping into chaos one lawn chair at a time. Then came a Monday morning, everything changed. I ran out around 7 to grab coffee and dog food before a systems check later that afternoon. Nothing unusual, just cold air, gray sky, sprinklers ticking somewhere down the block. But when I got home, 20 minutes later, the house felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. No soft hum from a server cabinet in the garage. No thermostat sync chime. No security panel glow. I checked my phone. No signal through the Wi-Fi. My stomach tightened. I walked into the garage, and every indicator light on my network rack was dead red. Not blinking. Dead. At first I figured it was a provider outage, but then I stepped into the alley behind my fence and saw the cable hanging loose beside the utility box. Cut so cleanly it looked surgical. Not weather damage. Not an accident. Somebody had taken a tool to it. And standing at the far end of the alley, holding a travel coffee mug in one hand like she'd just wandered into the scene by coincidence, was Carol Whitmore. She looked at the severed line, then at me, and gave this tiny, disappointed sigh. "That's unfortunate," she said calmly. "I warned you those wires were becoming a problem." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard her. I just stood there in the alley staring at Carol while cold wind pushed dead, leaves against the fence line, and there was something about the look on her face that bothered me more than the cable itself. She didn't look nervous. She didn't even look guilty. She looked satisfied, like somebody finally proving a point after a long argument nobody else realized they were having. "Did you cut that line?" I asked her, not loudly, just flat. Carol lifted her coffee cup and took a slow sip before answering. "Ryan, I would never touch someone else's property." Then she tilted her head toward the dangling cable. "But honestly, I can't say I'm surprised. Those installations were never appropriate for a residential neighborhood." And there was again that same tone she'd used every single time she handed out violations about flower beds or trash bins, except now we were standing over deliberate property damage like it was a conversation about lawn edging. She walked away before I could say another word, heels clicking against the pavement while I stood there trying to process whether this woman had actually lost her mind. I called the provider immediately. They confirmed there wasn't an outage anywhere nearby and promised to send an emergency technician the next morning. The woman on the phone sounded concerned the second I mentioned the line had been cut intentionally. "Please don't attempt to reconnect anything yourself, sir," she said. "We'll document everything when the technician arrives." I barely slept that night. Part of it was work stress because my backup hotspot connection was crawling so slowly it could barely load internal dashboards. But mostly it was the anger. Not explosive anger. Worse than that. The kind that just sits in your chest, making every thought sharper. I kept replaying the way Carol looked at that cable like she'd done the neighborhood a favor. Around midnight, I opened the neighborhood HOA app and typed out a short post explaining that my fiber line had been intentionally damaged and that the provider was investigating. I didn't accuse Carol directly because I still couldn't believe anybody would be stupid enough to actually do something like that over HOA complaints. The comments exploded almost immediately. Some neighbors were sympathetic. A few people joked about raccoons with wire cutters. One older guy named Dennis wrote, "This is why I trust nobody with a clipboard." Then Carol commented, "Of course she did. The HOA encourages all residents to ensure exterior installations remain compliant with community standards. We hope the issue is resolved quickly and peacefully." Peacefully, like we were discussing a noisy barbecue instead of sabotage. By morning, the post had turned into a full neighborhood argument. People were dragging up old complaints about Carol from years back, fines over mailbox paint shades, citations for holiday decorations staying up too long. One woman claimed Carol once measured her grass with a ruler. Honestly, it would have been funny if my career wasn't hanging by a thread because somebody decided to cosplay dictator of suburbia. The technician showed up around 8 the next morning. Big guy named Luis with a Broncos beanie and tired eyes that looked like he'd been awake since Reagan was president. He took one look at the line and whistled low under his breath. "Yeah, that's no accident." He crouched near the utility box, studying the cut, while snapping photos on a company tablet. "That's clean blade work. Probably pruning shears or a cable cutter. Can you fix it?" I asked. "Oh yeah, easy repair." He paused. "The weird part is your account already got flagged before I even arrived." That made me blink. "Flag how?" Luis stood slowly, brushing dirt off his jeans. "You got commercial priority routing tied into this address. Usually residential cuts don't trigger upstream alerts this fast." I stared at him. "Upstream alerts?" He nodded toward the line. When your connection dropped, systems flagged it as critical infrastructure interruption. I actually laughed a little because the sentence sounded ridiculous coming out of his mouth. Dude, I work from home. I don't run NORAD out of my garage. Hey, I'm just telling you what popped up. Then his expression shifted slightly as he looked back at the tablet. Huh, what? Nothing. But it clearly wasn't nothing because he stepped away and made a phone call in a quieter voice. Then another one. About 20 minutes later, while Luis was reconnecting temporary line access, two black sedans rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. And I mean slowly. The kind of slow that instantly makes every neighbor stop pretending not to stare. Doors opened. 3 people stepped out wearing dark jackets, and those neutral expressions government employees always seem trained to have. Not aggressive, not dramatic, just official. Curtains started moving all over the neighborhood. Garage doors froze halfway open. Across the street, old Mrs. Donnelly nearly dropped her watering can. Luis glanced at me. Well, he muttered, guess they escalated quicker than usual. One of the agents approached me holding a tablet. Ryan Mercer, he asked politely. I nodded. He introduced himself, but I forgot his name immediately because my brain was too busy trying to understand why federal investigators were standing in my driveway over internet cables. He asked a series of calm, precise questions. What time had I discovered the outage? Had I experienced prior harassment? Did anyone express hostility regarding the installation? I answered honestly and showed him the photos I'd taken the night before. Meanwhile, another agent walked the alley documenting the cut line from multiple angles. Then Carol appeared. Of course she did. She came striding down the sidewalk wearing a cream-colored sweater set like she was arriving for brunch instead of a federal inquiry. Excuse me, she said brightly, stepping toward the group. I'm president of the Homeowners Association. Is there some sort of issue affecting the neighborhood? One of the agents turned toward her with the kind of polite smile that somehow feels colder than anger. Ma'am, we're conducting a routine investigation involving interference with communications infrastructure. Carol folded her arms immediately. Well, I'm very concerned about unauthorized equipment installations in this neighborhood. I've documented several irregularities regarding this property already. I almost laughed at the timing. The agent looked at her for a moment. Did you report those concerns through utility channels? I reported them through the HOA. Did you physically interact with any communications equipment connected to this residence? There was the slightest pause. Tiny. Most people probably would have missed it. But when somebody spends years policing every word out of their mouth, even half a second feels loud. Of course not, Carol replied smoothly. I simply believe standards matter. The agent nodded once. Understood. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere of the street. Unfortunately, intentional tampering with protected communication lines can carry federal penalties, depending on network classification. Carol blinked. Just once. But that blink hit different. The confidence cracked for the first time since I'd met her. You could actually see the recalculation happening behind her eyes. And right then, from across the alley, a voice called out, excuse me? I think I got something you people should probably see. We all turned. My neighbor Ethan stood beside his garage, holding his phone with both hands like it contained a live grenade. Ethan was one of those quiet neighbors everybody likes, but nobody really knows much about. Software developer, divorced, always grilling alone on Sundays while listening to old jazz records loud enough for the whole block to hear. He walked over slowly and looked directly at the agents. My security camera faces the alley, he said. After Ryan posted last night, I checked the footage. Carol's face went completely still. Ethan tapped the screen a few times, then turned the phone around. Grainy black and white footage filled the display. Timestamp 2:14 a.m. A figure entered the alley wearing a hooded jacket, paused near the utility box, then crouched beside the line for about 30 seconds. When the person stood back up and turned slightly toward the camera, the porch light from across the alley caught the side of her face just enough. Carol, no question. Same posture, same haircut, same habit of tucking one arm tight against her body while walking. Nobody spoke for about 3 full seconds. Then Carol laughed. Actually laughed. short and sharp like she'd been insulted. "That's absurd," she snapped. "You can't identify anyone from that blurry footage." But her voice had changed now. Higher, tighter. One of the agents held out his hand toward Ethan. "May I?" Ethan passed him the phone. Carol looked at me then, and for the first time since all this started, she genuinely looked angry. Not annoyed, not superior, angry. Like somehow I had forced her into becoming the victim of her own choices. "You have any idea what people like you do to neighborhoods?" She hissed quietly enough only I could hear. "People like me?" I asked. She gestured vaguely toward my house. "All that equipment, strange vehicles, cables everywhere. This used to be a respectable street." I stared at her for a second because suddenly everything made horrible sense. This wasn't really about rules, or aesthetics, or community standards. Carol genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood from people she didn't understand. And somehow, in her mind, that justified everything. One of the agents stepped beside her then. "Ma'am, we're going to need a formal statement." Carol looked around the street as more neighbors gathered at the edges of driveways, pretending not to watch. The clipboard queen of Juniper Hollow suddenly looked very, very alone. By lunchtime, the entire neighborhood felt different, like somebody had quietly peeled the skin off the place and exposed what was underneath. The sedans were still parked outside my house, agents moving in and out with folders and tablets, while neighbors floated around the edges of the street, pretending they just happened to be checking mail for the fourth time that morning. And Carol Whitmore, stood near the sidewalk clutching that stupid clipboard against her chest like it could still protect her somehow. The repair crew finished reconnecting my line around 1 o'clock. The second the modem lights turned green again, my phone exploded with delayed notifications from work. Emails, system alerts, missed calls. One message from my supervisor simply read, "Federal inquiry already contacted us. Call when able." That sentence alone nearly gave me a heart attack. I stepped into my garage to return the call, and for 20 minutes I sat there listening to the soft hum of servers while explaining to a very confused program director why my neighborhood HOA president apparently declared war on telecommunications infrastructure. The craziest part? He didn't even sound angry. Mostly impressed. "Ryan," he finally said between laughs, "only you could turn suburban drama into a Homeland Security briefing." When I came back outside, one of the agents was speaking quietly with Carol near the curb. Her posture had changed completely now. Gone was that polished confidence she'd worn like armor for years. She looked tired, small almost. The agent handed her a business card and explained something in a calm voice while she nodded mechanically. "No handcuffs. No dramatic arrest." Honestly, I think part of the neighborhood felt disappointed about that. People always expect explosions when real life usually ends in paperwork. The sedans finally rolled away sometime after 3. Slowly again, deliberately, and when they disappeared around the corner, the entire block seemed to exhale at once. That evening, the HOA app turned into absolute chaos. Screenshots resurfaced from months earlier where Carol complained about suspicious utility modifications. People started sharing their own stories. One guy claimed she'd reported his nephew's car because it looked transient. A woman named Melissa posted that Carol once threatened fines because her wind chimes sounded emotionally disruptive. I swear to God she actually wrote that. But underneath all the jokes and outrage, there was something else too. Embarrassment. Because the truth was, everybody had let Carol become this untouchable authority figure simply because she acted confident enough for long enough. 2 nights later, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Attendance overflowed into the hallway. I almost didn't go, but Nate talked me into it. "Buddy," he said, "if your supervillain origin story gets a finale, you gotta watch the finale." The room went dead quiet when Carol walked in. She still dressed perfectly, cream blazer, pearl earrings, hair pinned neatly into place, but she looked like somebody trying to rebuild dignity from spare parts. The board members avoided eye contact with her completely. One of them, an older accountant named Jerry, cleared his throat and began reading a summary of the situation in the driest voice imaginable. Property interference, pending investigation, liability concerns, possible civil exposure for the HOA if prior complaints encouraged hostile action. Carol interrupted halfway through. I was trying to maintain standards, she snapped. Nobody else around here seems willing to anymore. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Jerry adjusted his glasses. Carol, cutting a resident's communication line goes somewhat beyond standards enforcement. I didn't know it would become federal, she shot back instantly. And there it was. The room reacted before she even realized what she'd admitted. You could actually hear people inhale. Carol froze. Her eyes widened slightly as the sentence replayed in her own head. Too late. Nate slowly leaned toward me and whispered, "Well, that's probably not helping." One of the board members asked quietly, "Carol, did you damage the line intentionally?" She looked around the room then, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely lost. Not angry, not defensive, just lost. "You don't understand," she said softly. "This neighborhood used to mean something." Nobody answered. Carol looked toward me suddenly. "You moved in with all that equipment, those strange contractor vehicles, wires running everywhere. People notice things like that." I almost laughed from disbelief. "Carol, I work remote IT. How was I supposed to know that?" she snapped. "Because I told you." Repeatedly. Silence again. Heavy silence this time. The kind that settles over a room when everybody realizes the problem was never misunderstanding. It was obsession, control, fear disguised as responsibility. Jerry finally called for a vote regarding temporary removal of HOA leadership authority pending investigation results. Every single hand went up. Unanimous. Carol stared at the board like she'd been physically struck. Then, without another word, she picked up her clipboard and walked out of the clubhouse alone. Nobody followed her. About a month later, the investigation officially ended. No criminal charges in the dramatic TV sense, but there were fines, restitution payments, civil penalties, and enough legal paperwork to drain most of Carol's retirement savings. She resigned from the HOA entirely 2 days after the settlement finalized. Then she just disappeared from neighborhood life. No more patrol walks. No more violation notices. No more passive-aggressive comments on the app about garbage bins and fence stains. And weirdly enough, the neighborhood became better afterward. People relaxed. Kids left bikes on lawns overnight without anyone threatening fines. Somebody painted their front door bright yellow, and nobody cared. We all started talking to each other more instead of reporting each other through apps like bored prison guards. A few weeks after everything settled down, I saw Carol one last time. I was outside around sunset replacing a porch light when she walked slowly down the sidewalk carrying groceries. She stopped when she noticed me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "Why'd you really do it?" She looked away toward the mountains, glowing orange in the distance. "Because every year this place felt less familiar," she said quietly. "People stopped caring about rules. Things changed." "Things always change," I replied. She nodded slowly like she hated hearing it because she knew it was true. Then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "I thought if I controlled enough little things, maybe nothing bigger would fall apart." And honestly, that was the first moment I actually felt sorry for her. Because beneath all the arrogance and control issues and HOA nonsense was just a lonely woman terrified of losing the version of the world she understood. Doesn't excuse what she did. Not even close. But explained it. She walked away after that without another word, disappearing down the sidewalk while porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood one by one. Meanwhile, my internet has never been better. The provider upgraded my line routing after the incident, added redundant failover systems, and every now and then when I check the network logs late at night and see everything running smooth and steady, I think about how insanely fragile people can become when they confuse order with ownership. So now I want to ask you something honestly. Was Carol just an entitled control freak who finally went too far? Or was she somebody who genuinely believed she was protecting her community and completely lost perspective along the way? And do you think the federal response was justified? Or did the system overreact to what started as a neighborhood dispute? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare neighbor yourself, trust me, I want to hear that story too.